Hey, welcome to the Supper Talk podcast, where we have all those dinner time conversations you don't want to have with your family. I'm Chris, and this is my dad, Steve.
Howdy.
This week, we're going to try and tackle all the world's problems by continuing to talk about Elon Musk. We're probably going to talk about the ceasefire agreement that's going on in Ukraine that's awaiting Russia's approval. And then we're going to kind of explore this really, really interesting thing called ectogenesis. And maybe look into where that could be in the future. But as for now, Dad, what's been on your plate this week?
Well, this is spring break week for me, so I'm off.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is, I get a 1 week break, and this is the last break I'll have from school until next Thanksgiving.
So, what is there to do for spring break in Boulder?
Oh, yeah, well, there's all kinds of things to
Because
do in
Boulder is a
Boulder.
college town, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the CU students are on spring break as well. And in the class that I go to each week, I've got two people that are in the same group that are teachers. So one of them is on spring break this week, and one is on spring break next week. So it's spring break season here at Boulder. But there's all kinds of things to do. I mean, and most of the things to do in Boulder are there's just so many trails that you can hike. There's so many places you can go. And there's music venues. Uh, they're getting ready for the Boulder International Film Festival. Boulder is actually in the running to be the permanent home for the Sundance Film Festival.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't I didn't know that. I have a funny story about Sundance. So Haley, one of the jobs that she had after we were done working at the travel agency together is she had this work from home job called WeWork. And there was a job that she had responded to where basically she was just going to be the assistant for some person that was in California, and she was going to be doing a bunch of administrative work. So she responds to this job posting, and it's uh, this interview that starts out with, "Can you Google fart sounds?" So she's interviewing with this guy, Brent, and Brent runs a company in California, and his company was the very first company to have the authorization from Dolby, the sound company, to finish movies in Dolby Atmos, which is now it's the standard when you go to movie theaters. And it used to be, you had mono, and then you had stereo, and then you had 5.1, and then you had 7.1, and it's the directions that the speakers were going. And what was new about Atmos is it had these upward directional speakers that would make it so that way you could have spatial audio. So that way, if there was an airplane that's going overhead, you'd actually hear the sounds of it going overhead and behind you in a theater experience. So his sound production company was the first company to make movies using this format. And the very first movie that was utilized in this was a movie called Swiss Army Man. And this is a movie that was directed by the Daniels. They did Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is a phenomenal movie. And Swiss Army Man is this movie with Paul Dano and Daniel Radcliffe. And it's a very, very human experience movie. It's really, really brilliant, in my opinion. But ultimately, the movie is a bunch of fart jokes. And the reason that it's a bunch of fart jokes is because it's the first movie to be done in this Atmos sound system. So the premise of it is Paul Dano in the beginning of the movie is this guy who's kind of like Tom Hanks in Castaway, and he's isolated on this island, but he's gotten to the end of his rope, and he literally has gotten to the end of it. So he makes a noose, and he's about to hang himself. And as he kicks the thing that's boosting him up to the noose out from underneath him, he sees a body wash up on shore. And while he's just hanging there, he's like, oh no, there's somebody that needs help. So the rope breaks, and the one thing that he tried to accomplish, he fails at, but then he can go to the rescue of this person who's washed up on shore. And it's Daniel Radcliffe, and it's a corpse, and it's just been floating around in the ocean for however long. And as corpses decompose, they have gases that expand in their body. And as Paul Dano's in just this absolute defeat, Daniel Radcliffe's body just starts farting. And Paul Dano starts kind of laughing, and then he realizes, I can make this into anything that I need. It can be my companion. I can talk to it. Or if I need to hunt, I can use the gases to make projectiles and hunt raccoons with it. He's going to be my Swiss Army man. So the movie utilizes fart jokes throughout the entire film to tell this really, really human story. It's a beautiful movie. And Haley's interview starts with, can you Google fart sounds? So this film winds up going to Sundance, and it's displayed, and it winds up getting a lot of notoriety. They, as soon as it airs in Boise, Brent winds up getting us tickets to make sure that we can go see it too. And her name was in the credits of this film that was in Sundance as assistant to the sound producer. And it's just this really, really interesting movie that, like, art house people have seen it and it's a great film. And then other people are like, wait, it's one of those weird Daniel Radcliffe movies that he did after Harry Potter. Yes. And it's great and it's fantastic and everyone should watch it.
I think if I was in a job interview and they said, hey, can you Google fart sounds? I'd be like, no, they call me.
That's with the new barber at this shop, when we had the interview, I was telling her very specifically, I used to work in corporate America. I have been on hiring teams. I've been part of the hiring panel for panel interviews. I've been the one-on-one supervisor that people interview. And after a company had announced massive amounts of layoffs, I was the person that did interview preparations, so that way hundreds of people could be ready for their new jobs. So I'm very, very accustomed to the formal way that interviews are going to be. But I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to say fuck a whole lot during this interview, just because I want you to get to know the person that you'll actually be working with. And I think it'd be really unfair to you for me to just be like, so tell me an area of opportunity that you have.
Yeah, there's well, that's probably a good segue to start talking about Musk when you're start talking about actually doing something nice, like helping people who are getting laid off prepare for their next job.
Yeah, that's it's been really kind of interesting for the last few weeks. I have been talking to more and more people at work that are either getting let go because their companies are seeing so much instability in the market and they're making decisions because of that. Like all of my stocks, I went from having a significant amount of gains to I've lost the actual money that I've put into the stocks now. So like there's a lot of people that are making decisions, and CEOs are included in those decision makers. So I've got a couple friends that have lost jobs because of private companies. I have a couple of clients that have lost jobs because they're federal workers. And then even Haley, she's a travel agent, but she does travel for universities. And that's the company that she works for. Is if you have grants, then all of that travel needs to be accommodated. And this is the corporation that manages it. But a lot of the schools that are going out and doing research are doing research on USAID funding. So now they're getting a significant amount of cuts as well. And her workload is being significantly impacted. So people want to say that it's just federal employees, and it's not just federal employees. It has such a bigger impact than just the federal workforce. And I think that that's, this is what I talked about last week with Elon on Rogan, was talking about how empathy is one of the weaknesses of Western culture. But honestly, I think that empathy is one of the things that can really bring us together, because there's so many more people that are impacted by this, that need to share their story with others, so that way they can recognize, hey, we're all kind of in this together. There's a bigger collective here than what they thought this was going to impact.
Yeah, there's I don't know if you remember this or not, but when we moved from Hawaii to Idaho, we went
I remember it was February and it was cold. Yeah, I remember that.
After living in Hawaii for almost 5 years, I guess.
Yeah.
There's all of a sudden it's like, whoa. I remember one of the things that was interesting was we were when we were driving into Idaho, we were going to Twin Falls, because that's where we stayed for a little while with your grandma Nita.
Yeah, I'll be driving there this Sunday.
There's when we were driving down the highway, I think that's 84. There's I can't remember what
85, yeah.
85, yeah. There's so we're driving down the highway, and that valley is so huge. I mean, it's just a massive valley.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like if you look when you're going to Twin Falls, if you look to the left, so the north, there's this massive mountain range that's off in the distance, and then if you look to the right, to the south, it's this just endless valley, and you can just like barely on a super clear day make out the very peaks of the Rocky Mountains. But
not anymore.
Yeah. What?
No, not with the development that's going on now. There's a big solar farm that's just outside of town past Micron. And once you get out to Mountain Home, it's actually a significant amount of housing that's starting to come from Mountain Home towards Boise, because with Micron's expansion of their fabrication plant, it's adding thousands of jobs to the area. And with most of the Treasure Valley being kind of developed the way that it has, really the only next space to develop that's a good location with like a direct commute for people is closer to Mountain Home. And considering most people are moving from areas where an hour-long commute isn't really that big of a deal, having a straight shot on something that you can go 80, for the most part, that's just a normal commute for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it. It's like been 13 years since I left Boise.
Yeah, and it's been the most rapidly developed 13 years.
Yeah, it's crazy. But the reason, I just remember that when we were driving through that valley, I was like, you could take the entire chain of Hawaiian Islands and set it down inside this valley, and there'd still be room to spare.
Yep. You could keep all the space in between the islands and you'd still be able to have the exact same footprint.
And it's like, even in Oahu, I mean, you can drive entirely, completely around the island on the very, going by the beaches the whole time in hour and a half.
Yeah.
There's,
yeah, you can circumnavigate the island pretty quickly. Like that's, I have a lot of clients that anytime they go to Hawaii for vacation, it's like stick to the North Shore and then just do like the whole interstate around the island. And I still don't understand why it's called an interstate, but just do the loop around the island.
It's called an interstate because there's
it goes in the state.
They needed federal funding to make the roads. And like that tunnel on the H3.
Yeah.
I mean, that tunnel cost a pretty
impressive.
Penny. Yeah.
That thing is huge.
And the mountain range that goes into it is just massive.
So you'd mentioned Elon, and I'm really curious with how diverse the Catholic population is. What's the conversation with people at school, or is this week not really been the week to know since everybody's on spring break?
It's really kind of interesting within the Catholic community. Um, People don't talk about politics nearly as much as they do in Protestant churches. And Protestant churches, no matter whether you're very, very liberal, very, very, aligned with the Democratic Party, or, uh, completely aligned with the Republican Party, the one thing that you can be certain of is that there's going to be ample political conversation to, in any, if you just start talking, people are going to be like, oh, well, did you hear about this? Uh, uh, you know, they would, talk about, you know, Trump kicking everybody out of the country or whatever. Or on the other side, it's like, oh, can you believe all these people that came into the country illegally think that they're entitled to this, that, or the other thing? So on either side, there's going to be all kinds of conversation. But really, the conversation, at least in the part of the Catholic community that I'm in, is more spiritual. It's more, it's and
It's less focused on things that can drive a wedge between you.
yeah, and I think part of it is just a recognition that that of two things really. One, uh, Catholic social teachings. So, I mean, there's a big document. I got it behind me. There's called the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. And so the Catholic Church has positions on all kinds of social issues. Pretty much any social issue that you could think of, um, there's a there's a there's a stance that the church has taken about
Any
that
issue?
particular thing. Yeah, probably pretty much.
Any issue? I'm gonna think about this one.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. There's I'm certain that there's some that are so like some aren't like addressed directly. So like in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, there are two paragraphs that kind of deal with substances that you consume. Um, and the first paragraph talks about food, alcohol, tobacco, and medications. And then the next paragraph, the one that's right out after that, talks about illegal substances, illegal
So,
drugs.
how does the conversation go towards something like uh the here's a good idea. You as a Catholic in Colorado can partake in microdosing of psilocybin, and you can view that as medication. And I in Idaho can also view that as medication, but it would be an illegal substance in Idaho. So is this where the type of conversation of where the nuance in Catholic stances can kind of take place?
Yeah, that's really a great example. There's because in there's because it's been established longer. I'll use cannabis as an example.
Okay.
Um, uh,
Which
because
is equally illegal because our freaking legislator and governor just made a mandatory minimum of $300 for any quantity whatsoever. Anyways,
yeah, there. So so here in Colorado, um, that would really be governed by the first paragraph, the paragraph that talks, and you could view it in really two different ways. One, it's aligned with alcohol, which is a lawful intoxicating substance, or you could say that it's medication. I would probably throw it into the lawful intoxicating substance category, because even people who are using cannabis medically are really also enjoying the benefit of the intoxication of the
100%.
yeah
100%. It's not like this is something that I'm using because it makes me more capable of things. It's doing it because it is removing parts of my reality. Like it intoxicates you from your experience that you're having in a sober mind.
yeah. But with regard to like here in Colorado, just a choice whether or not to use cannabis isn't really the only thing that's covered. So, would it be acceptable for a Catholic to get a job in a cannabis retail shop where they're selling cannabis to the public? And again, there you've got to look at it. Are they breaking the law by getting that job? No. Are they forcing other people to use an intoxicating substance? No.
Are they forcing other people to break the law?
No. Are they conscientiously obeying the laws that are designed to protect minors by double checking ID cards and checking out the state-run database? Yeah, all those things are in the affirmative. But then now let's take a person who is in Idaho that is doing that exact same thing. They're selling cannabis for personal consumption in a recreational use. So they're not getting those substances through any kind of a lawful supply chain. There's there's all kinds of possibilities in that unlawful supply chain for human trafficking to be taking place alongside of the drug trafficking, for forced labor to be used in order to move large quantities.
Basically, at any point that you're adding a criminal element, you can add any amount of criminal element. Whereas if you are doing things within the confines of the law, you're above reproach.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
without delving into the whole what's sinful and what's not sinful, there's it's
You don't want to get into that?
that would be an interesting conversation, but I think in this case, all we're really talking about is what is morally acceptable, and what's morally acceptable for one group or person might be unacceptable to others. And I think the Catholic teaching would be that for a person to sell cannabis unlawfully in Idaho, that would be immoral. Just because of the legal framework and all the potentiality for abuse. But that same person who gets a legit job in Colorado's paying taxes, everything's above board, the supply chains, everything's above board. There's no opportunity for child labor, for forced labor, for human trafficking. It would be a completely moral choice for that person to take that job selling it. And on the consumption side, if you're looking at alcohol, I mean, there's a big difference between going to a pub for happy hour, having 3 or even 5 beers, and then getting a cab home or having a designated driver or something like that. There's a big difference between that and, drinking 8 or 10 beers and then getting in a car and driving
Yeah.
home. So So again, is it immoral to consume alcohol? Not necessarily. Can you consume alcohol in an immoral way? Yeah, I think you can.
Yeah, and I always think the gray areas are really interesting when it comes to cannabis. Here in the Treasure Valley, we're an hour from the Oregon border, and it used to be that Huntington was the city that had all of the cannabis tourism because Malheur County didn't want anything to do with it, and eventually it got voted in that Malheur County, which was the border county, would allow the sale of cannabis. And as soon as that happened, Ontario just became a cannabis destination for people in Idaho. And the funniest part of all of this is the vast majority of the companies that are run in Oregon are owned by people that live here in the valley, and they know exactly where their money's coming from, and they're doing everything within a legal way, and they're let people that are going to make their own decisions to drive that hour and go make whatever risks they want to make for their own lives. But while you're in Oregon, you can purchase it, and you're making legal decisions while you're in Oregon. And it's just interesting to see how many businesses live in that gray area of ethics.
Yeah, and it's so, I think it's unfortunate myself that because, you know, we should have learned a pretty big lesson from uh, our prohibition era. And that was a pretty unique thing. Prohibition was really part of the feminist movement at the time, and um, and it was and the federal law regarding prohibition was kind of a nod to the uh, uh, to the to the feminists in the United States. But it ended up being a disaster. I mean, a horrible disaster. And we did all the things that I just talked about that make that make those, moral weightings. We created an underground, unlawful trafficking system, an unlawful, supply chain where people were making bathtub gin,
Mm.
and people are buying bathtub gin, and it's got all this,
Well,
these
and it added
toxins.
an additional criminal element because you had people that were actively defending their ability to make money off of something that people still wanted. And that's the thing that I don't understand here in Idaho, because everybody still wants it. And whether or not the votes are coming through in these proposals to add, so there's a handful of ballot initiatives that have been going on throughout the years to try and get legislation added onto a ballot that we can vote on to make laws change. And the legislature in this session has made it so that way there can be no new bills introduced by the public. There can be no new ballot measures added. So that way there can be no new future laws for cannabis changed. This came alongside this minimum fine of $300 for any amount of cannabis on your person. And that's not taking away from if you have felony amounts or if you have misdemeanor amounts. Like, the infraction is still the infraction, the crime's still the crime, but now no matter what, you're going to be charged. And they think that they're going to make more money off of people who are going to get caught when those people have not been getting caught. And it's not like law enforcement's getting any more money to do patrolling. When they fail to recognize that Malheur County, the border county, made 10% of the entire state's tax revenue for Oregon all through cannabis sales. And instead of looking at the fact that you can remove the criminal element, you can get so much additional income coming into your state through taxes, and you can make it so that way the money is coming into Idaho instead of Oregon. But no, we want it to be sinful. We want it to be immoral. We want it to continue to be a criminal thing. And it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, just this past week, I was reading a study that was published by Brigham Young University down in Salt Lake, um, and it was an interesting study. I thought it was on toxic perfectionism, and the reason I
I
thought it
know
was
nothing about that.
yeah. There's the reason why it was so interesting is because this is a movement of young people in BYU, which is a traditional university that has been training young
Future Mormon leaders.
Yeah, there's and these young people are like they're just sick and tired of this unachievable standard of perfection that's being placed upon them by the older generations within the LDS Church, and interestingly enough, the first time the church started talking about it, one of the members of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, so we're talking, I mean, this guy's got to be at least a boomer or
the upper echelon high leadership of the church.
Yeah, and he actually brought up this issue of toxic perfectionism because it's that they just set for themselves these moral standards where you can't drink Pepsi, you can't drink coffee, you can't all these. There's very, very, minutia focused moral precepts.
And the current generation is swinging hard because, like, I was just talking to Haley the other day. There's this company in town called Sodalicious, and all it is soda. It's a drive-through soda shack where you're getting buckets of sugar. And I don't understand it. I drink sparkling water. Like after I quit drinking soda too. And I just started kind of going on a water kick. And I just don't understand soda. But because of the whole Real Housewives of Salt Lake and the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, and these young people that are in the Mormon church that are really, really starting to showcase like, hey, we don't have to be these humble people that all of the prior generations have told us out to be. Let's swing really hard in that direction. And it's the craziest amount of sugar consumption I've ever seen from a generation.
There's what's interesting about I think you're absolutely right that they're swinging the other way, and I think that's why that particular apostle started talking about it. It's because they should be concerned that they're going to drive young people away from faith, which can be one of the most stabilizing influences on a human's life is having a faith that kind of gives you a purpose outside of yourself. So there's in the materialist world, it's like, oh well, everything just matters to me. So whatever I want to do, as long as I'm not hurting you, you should just let me do whatever it is that I want to do because I am the most important thing to me. That's a very materialist view, and but it can be very hollow, and having something outside of yourself that is your overarching goal. It's like whether it's it's like if I'm just working in order to get money so that I can get the things that I want, there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's not immoral, but you miss out on the opportunity to, when you go to work, you're doing something beyond making money for yourself. You're you're making a difference, you're making community, you're
Yeah,
giving
you're
place.
building relationships with people.
Yeah. So I think that they're wise to say, oh well, maybe we want to look at this, but in Idaho, the political power makers are the people who are driving that toxic perfectionism. It's the exact same group of people, um, and they don't have that view that, oh well, maybe we ought to try and figure out a way um, um, to encourage people to make faith-based moral decisions rather than just rattle off a list of codes that they have to obey. But your laws, and I mean, and not just their laws, but uh, the the congressional or the legislative proclamation that's going through, and I don't know if I haven't looked at it in the last couple of weeks, where they want to send a letter, this proclamation to the Supreme Court, encouraging the Supreme Court to overturn Obergefell, which is the same-sex marriage
Yeah.
decision that guarantees that right in all the states. And it's interesting because it's the way that Obergefell was designed, the decision was made, is very similar to voting. So like people are like, oh well, women have the right to vote in every state. And that's not true. There is no right for anyone to vote in the U.S. There are laws that make it so that you can't take away a person's ability to vote because they're a woman. You can't use race as an exclusionary factor, but you can use all kinds of other things to exclude people from voting. There's no federally established right for any human being to vote. That power is vested in all the states, and states have different rules on who can vote. And
Yeah, whether or not you're a felon or whether or not you are there legally, illegally, some states are okay because you are there as a contributor to their society, that you should vote in how the society acts. Others say that if you're not there legally, then you shouldn't have any say whatsoever. So there's no like human right towards it.
yeah, but but in Idaho, you've just got this really lockstep, very far into the traditionalist. Now, the other one good thing is they are traditional conservatives in Idaho, so it's not like they're just they're not like the current national GOP, which is really more populist. Whatever we can do to make people happy with us, they're like, no, there's our system is pretty good. And
Speaking of making people happy with us, how'd you feel about Trump shilling Teslas on the White House lawn?
yeah, that's one of the there. It's very it's interesting in that people are upset that Trump showed Teslas on the White House lawn, but nobody was upset when
Biden did it with F-150s.
Yeah, when Biden is driving electric F-150s and giving articles, oh man, this is the greatest thing or whatever. So to a certain extent, it's just a little bit of hand wringing.
I think it's a little bit different though, because this is the protests against Tesla have been very, very parallel to all the 50-51 protests. So there's another protest on Saturday that's going to be a nationwide protest in all major cities, and this is the third of the 50-51 protests. First one was on a Wednesday, and I was able to do that because we record on Wednesdays. Wednesdays is my day off. Second one was on a federal holiday, which was a Monday, but I work Mondays, and most people work Mondays, except I hear a lot of federal employees had that day off. So there was a little bit more people that showed up on that one. this is going to be the first one that's on a weekend. So it's going to be this huge, huge event. But the conversations that are taking place with all these 5051 protests, there's separate conversations that are like, fuck you, Elon, let's get you where your money's at. And that's Tesla. And there have been reports of Tesla charging stations that are putting like reinforced cabling around their power cords because people have just been coming by with bolt cutters to sever power ties. There have been Teslas that have just been lit on fire. There's a significant amount of Cybertrucks that just get vandalized to no end, which they're already ugly. It's not like you're going to make them any uglier. But I think it's really interesting that the difference between Trump selling Teslas on the White House versus Biden selling F-150s at the White House is Trump is doing this to defend the person that he has put into a position in actions that are being taken against that person that are the direct voice of American people showing the dissatisfaction with the president's action. And I think that that's where there's a little bit of a difference in this is he's continuing to put his faith in this decision for this individual. And I'm curious how long he is going to stand by that decision, if it's going to be the entire 18 months, if the stock markets continue to show what they're doing because of the instability, and if the American people's voice winds up continuing to get louder and louder and louder about these things. I think that there's a couple fundamental differences between the two situations.
Yeah, we've had a couple protests here in Boulder and Boulder County. There's a Tesla dealership in Lafayette, and there was a protest there. So that's Boulder County.
We've got one right down the street from us, and there was one, I think it was like 2 Saturdays ago.
And then we've got a lot of, the NOAA Atmospheric Research Laboratory is a big laboratory here in town. And so there was a protest there. And see, here's the thing that just kind of surprised me, but they didn't do it. So they had a protest at NOAA, and they had a protest at the Tesla dealership. And it was, there were a lot of people there, and, there was some local news buzz. But, for Musk, that was just, here was another protest at a particular place, and he doesn't care about the federal employees, so that didn't. But his brother, so Kimball Musk,
You've already told me your opinions of last week.
Yeah, so Kimball Musk has 2 establishments here in Boulder, both within a mile of my apartment. He's got his corporate headquarters that's just a few blocks from my apartment. That he's got 2 major companies that he runs. One is called the Kitchen Restaurant Group, and then the other is called Nova Sky Stories.
And that's his drone company.
That's his drone company. And then just on the other side of the pedestrian mall, so that's on East Pearl Street, and just on the other side of the pedestrian mall on West Pearl Street is the Kitchen Restaurant, which is his flagship restaurant from the Kitchen Restaurant Group. So I'm like, if you really want to step on Elon Musk's toes, step on his brother's livelihood, and make his brother, call the Boulder police and try and get traffic control so that people would allow folks to get into his restaurant. You could with just a couple hundred people, you could start a picket line just walking on the public sidewalk around his restaurant.
Wouldn't it be terrible if people just took this idea?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it just be horrible?
I mean, as long as you're, walking along the sidewalk holding a sign and not, not stopping and trying to, prevent people from going through, but
Yeah, be
making this,
combative. Yeah.
yeah, as long as you're not doing that, you're not breaking any laws, but you're making people in effect cross that line in order to go, get a
Support the
cocktail.
person that you don't want to have supported.
That's exactly right. And then the same thing on the East End with his corporate headquarters. There's all sorts of room there, public space room, where you could have a protest, and it really could go one of two ways. It could either be detrimental to his neighborhood business, or if people are like, hey, let's go protest Musk and then get breakfast at Snooze, or let's go protest.
Let's support his competitors.
Yeah, they're not necessarily his competitors, but they're his neighbor businesses.
Yeah.
So he could be like trying to stop these protests, but the foolish Craig's is like, hey, my breakfast sales have been through the roof since these protests start. So anyway, there's and what that's going to do is that's going to get a phone call directly to Elon Musk, directly from his brother, who, oh, by the way, also sits on the board of both Tesla and SpaceX.
I should not have left the conversation that I was a part of. But I know this is such a good idea for people in Boulder. It's a shame that you're not a passionate person to want to organize that.
Yeah, I'm just, for me, I'm not a...
You're just the person who has planned on how to prevent other people from being able to do stuff like this. So you've had to experience like, okay, well, how would I plan this out?
Yeah, and to me, it's one of those things. It's like, Musk does not have a traditional set of morals and values. So his morals and values are in the same way that his plans and his mind is elevated. There's so that he's thinking about interplanetary travel while other people are, where do I want to go for lunch or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing with his morals. He's like, oh, okay, well, if this actually helps me get to Mars, I don't care if it involves child labor. I don't care if it involves I don't think that there's a lot of moral decisions that most people would consider unethical that Musk wouldn't consider.
I listened to the rest of the episode over the last week, and he had an interesting conversation about his desires with Mars. And it was the part of the episode that I actually gave the most attention to, because in the way that he's talking about it, he has kind of an interesting reason for why he wants to go as much as he does. And when he explains kind of the process and how quickly he wants to go, I didn't realize that they're planning their first launch next November. And apparently there's this geosynchronous orbit that Earth and Mars get into, where if you launch at the right time, that it's a 6-month trip as opposed to like an 18-month trip. So you can save a significant amount of fuel. And this happens about every 26 months. So they're going to start launching next year, and within 15 to 20 of these cycles, so roughly 32-ish years, they're planning on having about 1 million people. But it's interesting seeing how he does think about things, because Tesla is starting to move more towards like robotics and AI as opposed to it just being a car company, and seeing their autonomous robots and how they've been able to compete with the capabilities of what Boston Dynamics has been doing. One of the things that he was talking about is that the first couple of missions that he's going to be sending is like, well, first off, does it land? Because, if it doesn't land, we don't want to send people, obviously. But he wants to send a lot of autonomous robots to do all of the work to get the space ready. And, there's a show on Apple that Haley and I watch called For All Mankind. And it's kind of this alternative history of what would have happened if the Russians had beaten us to the moon. And because Americans are Americans, well, you might have been first, but we're going to be best. So you might be the first to be on the moon, but we're going to be the first one to put a base on the moon. And then Russia's like, well, you got a base on the moon. We're going to have 2 bases on the moon. And Russia beating the US actually pushes Americans to strive to be even better, and it forces competition. So the space race gets insane. And each season is a decade following space agencies. And in the 4th season, they actually have started developing Mars, and it's a lot of underground living, and there's a lot of domes, but they never really talk about how it's actually developed. And I think the conversation that a lot of people have had for years is the idea of terraforming Mars and, sending these huge nuclear experiments to fundamentally change the planet. But like, that's going to take so many generations. So what he's talking about is that we're in this really unique time in history where we have both technology and opportunity. And when you look at the birth rates of nations, and this is one of the things that he's been talking about for years, but you don't really take into consideration how many generations before certain societies will collapse within themselves. And it won't necessarily be nuclear Armageddon or a meteor hitting the planet, but it'll be people like me who got vasectomies and just didn't repopulate the planet, and then we all die in adult diapers. So he's talking about how we're in this small window where there's an opportunity, and 30 to 50 years is kind of the good estimate of, if we're being really, really aggressive with this, then we'll be able to create a backup plan for the light of consciousness. And hearing him talk about this term that he uses, the light of consciousness, is kind of interesting. And it definitely gives perspective of how he views things, because to your point, he has a mission to get off this rock. And I don't think that there is anything outside of, I must preserve the light of consciousness. And if there's people here that are in his way, he won't let that stop him. And if there's people that are here that can help him, he will let them help him. There's no right, wrong towards that goal. There's only getting that goal accomplished.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good transition to start talking about the whole idea of ectogenesis.
Yeah, and especially for trying to get people off world.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much one of the ways that you could do that, is because just logistically, every 3 years we get into a geosynchronous.
But before we get into that really quick, do me a quick favor. Explain what ectogenesis is for people who've never heard of this.
Okay, ectogenesis is so Genesis is creation and ecto is outside of.
External.
So yeah, external. So it's the creation of life outside of a host body, a mother. So, and in terms of humans and humanity, it would be creating humans without the use of a host mother for the gestation.
For layman's terms, this is synthetic wombs. And there's a couple of ways that you can approach this. There are legitimate test tube babies that you could have the same kind of process with in vitro fertilization, and you could implant these fertilized embryos into synthetic wombs that are called biobags. And a synthetic amniotic fluid would allow for the development of a synthetic human. And this has been kind of tested on infant lambs recently, but the way that those were actually done was essentially a type of cesarean section was done on the mom early enough in the pregnancy that they could move the infant in utero out of utero and into the synthetic womb. And it's some of the most insane pictures to see these developing lamb, not quite embryos, not
In a
quite
Ziploc
babies.
baggie.
Yeah, like it honestly looks like when you had your commercial vacuum sealer and just meat was vacuum sealed.
Yep. Yeah. There's and it's really well, the big technology is, so we already do kind of the same thing for really premature babies. So we used to premature babies, when they were really early, they had a very low survival rate, and we would put them on CPAP ventilation with oxygen supplementation to try and get them through the developmental period that it takes for their lungs to develop.
And a lot of the times they were in these enclosures to protect them from the outside world. And a lot of the times it was even like these sterile gloves that you would have to utilize to be able to interact with the infants.
Yeah, and there's new techniques where they actually, rather than using CPAP for air, which is it's basically just pressurized air that forces you to breathe. We use CPAP machines for people who have sleep apnea. The Pope has been on CPAP for when he sleeps, so that his breathing rate can be, kind of more closely monitored while he's sleeping. But there's new technology where, rather than doing that, what they do is they use oxygenated fluid, and the baby who's already going to be inside of a
Ziploc bag.
Well, but it's like a nursery, little incubator thing.
We're talking about the old way, not the new way.
But they're already in this contained environment, so they just make it so that it's a fluid environment, and the fluid maintains a consistent temperature for the baby to grow up in, and the baby's used to breathing in and out fluid from when they were in the womb.
So it's kind of like Luke Skywalker in the Bacta tank.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, very much so. But so we're already doing that, where it's the other end, and there's this, currently there's a 14-day rule. So, if you do in vitro fertilization and you've got human ovum that have been fertilized outside of a human body, current law in the United States says that after 14 days, those embryo have to be either implanted into a mother, or frozen, or destroyed. So you got 14 days. And that's kind of the backstop that prevents ectogenesis. So you have to, you would have to do IVF and then implant the fetus into a mother, allow the mother to gestate that embryo to a particular state, and then harvest that developing child and put it into a bag, that's a lot of procedures, and it still involves a human being.
Well, so, and it also, there's a when I was reading about it earlier, when you had sent me that article, it talks a lot about the risks of how challenging it is, because the capillaries and arteries of the baby are so small and so fragile that there's a big risk with fetal mortality rates. And that's one of the big problems that they've had with the infant lambs, is using the procedure that they're currently using. It's more likely that the infant's not going to survive to full gestation. which is where kind of what you were talking about earlier, the idea of doing more of this in vitro implanting into might seem to be the better way of being able to start the process. So that way there's not a physical manipulation of one body to put the fertilized ovum into, the bio bag.
Yeah, and the real the real challenge is placenta replication. So the good news on it is that the placenta isn't developed by the mother. The placenta is developed by the child. So the same cells that that eventually become the human baby, some of those cells become a placenta. And the placenta is one of the most fascinating uh, components of creation, because it really does the work of two of the most complex organs that the body has, the liver and the kidneys. So in a human being, the liver is kind of like the nutrition factory. So it stores amino acids, it creates amino acids, it configures proteins that are needed by the body, so it's really this. It's the center of, and it's a genuine factory. So it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to make this stuff so that I can have a store of it when I need it. So it works as a warehouse. It works as a factory building those things.
But then it also eliminates all the waste products.
No, well, that's it does. That's why I was bringing up the kidneys, because the chemical waste gets filtered out by kidneys, and solid waste is just unconsumed food that is ejected by the lower intestine and the colon. So, and that's why I say the placenta does both of those. So the placenta, using the blood of the baby, absorbs nutrients from the mother's blood, and then takes those nutrients, same thing, amino acids, proteins, all the stuff that the liver does normally in a human, it does on behalf of the baby. And then as the baby develops its organs, those organs will take over that production and that waste removal. So like babies, urinate and defecate inside the inside the womb, but the defecation is really just kind of like pooping out nothing, because it's
right.
just they're not really eating any food, right? And the same thing with but the urine is legit chemical waste that comes out of the baby, and then the baby pees it out. But it's not like it doesn't become toxic. But like you were late. So you were almost a month late. And
I was cooked.
Yeah, we actually had to go into the hospital and have them induce your mother's labor, because and the reason that becomes important, there's a lot of other things. I mean, you can get too big. There's all kinds of things that can happen. But one of the reasons is because it changes the environment of the amniotic sac, because you're peeing in there all the time, and normally it's not a problem, because it's like, oh, okay, well, there's only a short period of time from when your kidneys take over from your mother's waste removal. so it's not that big a deal. But the later you go, the more fully developed your kidneys are, and there's no place for that fluid to go.
Yeah.
And like your one of the problems that your mother had, I think it was called uh, hyperamniotosis or something like that. But it was basically she had too much water. So she was huge. I mean, just absolutely huge in terms of like uh, her abdomen size. But it wasn't that you were that big. It was,
It's just that she was retaining a lot of water because of the situation with how I was impacting her body.
yeah, yeah.
You're
So
not
that,
calling her fat.
yeah. So that there's so that placenta uh could, you could take and just put the ovum into I used a bio bag example, put it into a bio bag and allow the placenta to develop, and then really all you're doing is hooking up pipes to the placenta and then letting the placenta continue to grow and do what it's supposed to do. And all the placenta needs is a blood exchange. So and you could easily use a synthetic blood, right? That has a universal type. Um, and but the but the I mean, you just have to imagine the kind of surgery that would be to attach um, artificial blood vessels to these tiny little microscopic, um, uh, blood vessels that are in the developing placenta uh, that the ovum is attached to. So
Well, and also you'd also have to take into consideration of how often would you have to adjust what those catheters would be in the reality of the size of the veins diameter is going to be changing as the baby develops. Like it's going to become a thicker, more developed vein over the weeks. So do you have to continually do that throughout the entire time? Whereas if it's naturally happening and those are natural attachments, they'll naturally contract with the baby's development. So yeah, it's interesting with where it's at right now because it's definitely the beginnings of a new technology. It's certainly not viable anytime soon, and there's a lot of hurdles that are going, but there's a lot of ethical areas that you could look at because, if this could potentially help people not need surrogate mothers. And I have a friend who's been a surrogate for many moms who haven't been able to go through the pregnancy themselves. That's one of the things that Haley and I have decided that we never wanted to have kids because she has enough medical issues that we're not sure she'd be able to make it through the pregnancy. And if we could do IVF and not put it into a surrogacy for somebody else, that could give someone like us an opportunity. But I could also see someone who has a significant amount of money saying like, well, I don't want to deal with being pregnant. And them just simply paying for a procedure because it's an outpatient procedure to have it transferred over to a bio bag and then somebody else can deal with it. And I can have my 9 months back to myself and I can get new mom ready while the baby is getting ready on its own. And that creates its own ethical situation that person can deal with in making life a form of capitalism, which is a weird crossover. But then the idea of what we were talking about earlier with Musk, like if you really want to populate a planet, that's an efficient way. And he is really, really good at finding some heartless ways of being efficient recently.
Yeah, and so think about it. When I think about how will we need to, you know, formulate things in order to get significant equipment to Mars during that very narrow window where where the travel time is pretty low. So we could spend 3 years just taking starships and putting them into a high Earth orbit and leaving them there. There's not a lot of stuff up in high Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit is very, very crowded. So put them up above everything else. And
that's what he's talking about for future iterations, is the rapid redeployment and rapid refueling. So that way you can just launch them up, get them to a refueling station, and get them out even more.
Yeah, and if you spend 3 years beforehand putting them up there, filling them with fuel, so that you've got, I mean, I'll just pull a number out of the air. You've got 500 starships that are in a parking lot in a geosynchronous high Earth orbit, and you're just waiting for the perfect day to start them on their movement to Mars. Well, because you don't have to launch like one and then the next and then the next and then the next and the next. They can all just
move.
It's exactly right. So you've got like
you got an armada at that point.
Yeah, you've got a convoy of 500 starships that all light their engines at the same time, and they fly in formation and then stop in an orbit around Mars. So one of the things that you could do is, let's say that you're like, oh, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have one child care worker for every 15, 25 children. So you just create biobags that have fertilized ovum and put them in a starship, and that starship basically becomes a nursery to where those children are born, and they go through all of their early child, through toddler years.
See, and this is, I see where this could be a good idea, but I don't necessarily think that it could work like that, specifically because one of the issues with the two-stranded astronauts that are in space right now is they're having an extended amount of time in space, and they were not anticipating the amount of time. And because of that, while you're in a zero-gravity environment, you have a little bit more bone density loss. So this is one of those ethical experiments that you don't know until you're in the midst of it, but what kind of bone density issues would be created for a generation of children that are synthetically grown in space?
Yeah. And they're never exposed during their early childhood years. They're never exposed to anything except for microgravity.
Yeah, and the pressure of the birth canal is never something that pushes their lungs into place. It never corrects their body. It's just popping the bio bag open, and here you are. Because that's one of the benefits of natural childbirth that people don't necessarily realize, is that challenge of pushing the baby through the birth canal is what kind of aligns the things in the body so that way it works more properly.
Yeah, so we're talking about an evolutionary path,
yeah,
that would be very different than the natural human path. And even once they get to Mars, they would
different day cycles. It's a soul instead of a day, and it's a different gravity. So it would be a completely different path of what that would look like 5,000 years from now.
So the first thing, and this is where we're getting closer to what is potentially actually viable, is so before we would do that, before we would send 50,000 children to Mars, we would begin that by doing ectogenesis experiments in a space station type atmosphere in high Earth orbit. And that would start with not sending humans up, but it would be very much like what the pictures that you saw of the lambs inside of biobags. We would do experiments with animals in an ultra microgravity. The current space station wouldn't be able to do this.
The current space station operates under maritime law, doesn't it?
I've never really looked at that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does, because I'm trying to think of a situation where something like this could even happen. And realistically, I think that Musk has to, in this effort, he needs to create his own private space station. And he needs to be able to do that because then it is him operating outside of international laws and outside of planetary restrictions, unless it still falls under maritime. And if he can do that, then he can do really weird, ethically questionable things in space.
Yeah, and so now the Musk efforts to deorbit the space station ahead of schedule. So the contract was already awarded to SpaceX to deorbit the space station. I think it's in 2030.
Yeah, this was the intentional crashing into it wasn't going to be in a landmass. I think it was going to be into the ocean because it's been up there for so long that it's more expensive to maintain than it's worth.
That's it's
That's
interesting.
the narrative, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that this thing's leaking. It's
right.
Like so it's got so
it's the same reason that we're not using the shuttles anymore. Like the technology of when it got up there was us trying to figure it out, but things are much better and arguably there's more efficient processes, and there needs to be this violent process that removes the existing thing.
Yeah, and China is building a space shuttle or a space station now. Using.
Did you see the Athena lander on the dark side of the moon?
When it landed on its side or whatever?
Yeah. Well, so that was the original one. It couldn't land. This one was like a week or two ago, and there's a spot on the southern hemisphere of the moon that's just like a permanent shadow. And it was supposed to land there so that way we could get information about this spot that we've never seen. And it gets there, and within 24 hours, completely goes offline. It's like, well, there's a big failure for you.
Yeah, and it's like when a surgeon is performing telesurgery, where there's a robot that's operating on an actual human being, and this person is manipulating that robot through an internet connection. And that's kind of what everything in space is. It's like you're completely operating everything, either autonomous drones or remotely.
And that's one of the reasons why he's talking so much about having like the Optimus robots go out, and they'll probably have their own version of the Spot Dog, but information travels at speed of light, and Mars is far enough away that it's about 4 to 8 light minutes, depending on how far away we are. So and this was a problem that they talked about in the For All Mankind show. There was, was the Curiosity rover that was the last rover on Mars that lasted way longer than its original mission ever was planning on. But it takes roughly, if everything is aligned properly, it'll take as little as 8 minutes for a message to go, and then it'll potentially do its thing, and then it'll relay a message back to you. So on a good opportunity, it's 20 minutes for you to send it a message, it do the thing, and then it tells you that it's done the thing. But if things aren't aligned, it could be as much as 40 minutes. So the idea of spending that much time to do individual tasks, it's not going to be very efficient. So if you have all these autonomous drones that are just like, here's your mission, go make this happen, you could actually wind up having the very first mission being find the most habitable location.
Yeah. I mean, you could, and I think this ends up being very much closer to reality than, all of a sudden sending 100,000 people to Mars when I mean, you can pack, humanoid drones, into a starship where you got, I don't know what the capacity, but you're talking tens of thousands
Yeah, you can
of,
fold them in the fetal position in a way that you can't fold people.
yeah, and they're all just, uh, programmed before they leave, um, and in that same way, just put a bunch of starships up in a high Earth orbit and send an armada of drones. So then, if you've got 500 ships that are going to attempt a landing on Mars, and half of those ships are filled with humanoid drones, the others are filled with um, flying drones and vehicles that the humanoid drones can ride in, and then the material for building, a base and extracting methane from the environment, all those kinds of things. Then then even if half of them crash and burn in the Martian atmosphere, then you're still going to have a sizable workforce that makes its way to the surface of Mars.
And
And
it, go ahead.
and if you look at the rover, experiences that we had, um, there's we know that we can have mechanical objects that can operate it, because like Mars gets these horrific sandstorms that
Hmm.
cover the entire planet for more than a year. So all that would make it be very difficult for to build a city for humans.
But something
But
with LiDAR,
yeah, and
yeah.
so there's and while all that's going on, we're using a high Earth orbit space station of some kind to conduct a kind of research, um, so that we'll know, well, uh, when a, if a human baby is born on Mars, um, how is that gravity and environment going to affect that human's um, uh, viability? Well, there's and we are. I mean, do we end up placing um, humans into divergent evolutionary um, paths?
Do we have Earthlings and Martians? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. There's because the people that are born in microgravity may not be evolutionary adapted for Earth's gravity. So people who are born on Mars may be literal Martians. That's where you're going to be for the rest of for all of however long we're able to sustain life on Mars.
So here's the hypothetical. So let's say he does this every 26 months. He's launching. First launch, they make maybe 3 craters on Mars, and then they learn a lot of lessons. Next time, they make 1 crater on Mars, and then they have got 4 things that are landing. So now, the third launch, you're seeing more consistency. By the fifth launch, there is so much consistency that now this is a rapidly deployed, easily seeing as safe, and it is working. And you can start seeing the development of what's happening with all these autonomous drones, because by the fifth one, now you're about 10 years into the development of it. So 15 years into it is when the first group of people that get asked to go to Mars can go to be the very first explorers of the great unknown. And then let's say it's the 20th or the 25th iteration, and you're getting to your last years. Would you want to die on Mars?
Yeah, and that's where I think it folds back into the ectogenesis thing, because one of the things that Musk is like, well, we would need to have a city of about 1 million people in order to have a sustainable human life on Mars. Well, getting 1 million volunteers to make that trip,
Yeah.
and
it's a one-way trip. You don't get to come back.
Yeah, it's a one-way trip. So then there's what you're left with on Mars is the reproduction rate. All right. So there's and so people go to Mars and then they just naturally get pregnant on Mars. And there's hospitals on Mars or birthing centers on Mars, and these children are born on Mars where they don't get any choice. They were born on Mars. So they're stuck living with their parents' choice. So and that's where I'm like, oh, okay, well, what if you could have, so trying to get 2 humans to make 25 babies is, wow, that's difficult. And
Elon Musk has billions of dollars and he's only halfway there.
So if you can convince 1 human to travel to Mars and become the child care provider for 25 ectogenically created humans, well, now your replacement rate is off the charts in terms of the natural fertility rate that humans can achieve in societies. So that would allow you to more quickly get that, meet that population gap. But again, this is all, so, I mean, there's technology advancements that need to be made, but I don't think, you saw the same data that I saw. I don't think it's unreasonable to say, in 10 years, we're going to be able to do this.
Yeah. I honestly don't think that it's unreasonable to think that we won't see at least 100,000 people on Mars within our lifetime. I think that, and in your lifetime specifically, I think 100,000 is a doable number with what his goals are.
So, but how do you get there? And I think that that ectogenetic development of societies would be a shorter path to having 1 million people on Mars. So now we're stuck with, and this is where my interest in theological anthropology. So anthropologically, humans will have the technology to do that, but theologically, should we do that?
Well, just because you can believe that you were made in God's image, does that mean that you will stay in God's image?
Yeah, and so it's really, it's really fascinating. I was thinking about this on my walk this morning. I mean, I'll just use the Catholic perspective on the uniqueness of human life. Every human is not just inherently valuable because of their humanness. They're inherently unique humans. So every single person has, by my count, and again from a Catholic perspective, has three strands of uniqueness. So we have a genetic strand of uniqueness in that at the moment of conception, that fertilized ovum has a unique DNA imprint that will progress naturally to a human being with a lifelong pattern following that uniqueness. So it'll always be there for as long as they're materially alive. And then they also have what I call a circumstantial uniqueness, because every human has a unique experience of life.
Yeah, Brad and I have the same parents, but that doesn't mean that Brad has an older brother. I have an older brother. He has a younger brother. Those are two different experiences from the perspective of those having them.
Yeah, and even in the IVF world, they may take 10 eggs and fertilize 10 eggs, in vitro, and then because there's that 14-day limit, they're going to evaluate those 10 ovum, and they're going to say, okay, well, we think these 4 are viable, these 6 are not viable, so we're going to destroy them. Well, they're evaluating each one of those ovums as a unique individual, and those 14-day old blastocytes have had a unique enough experience that some are viable and some are not.
So, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but you just got me thinking of something. So, if Musk is needing to do this in scale, does he create a situation where he is getting all 10 because I need all 10, I need as many as I can get, or is he being selective because he knows that this is going to be the genesis of the entire culture that will be the planet? And I think that that's kind of an interesting situation that you could find yourself in, because if there are certain quality control measures that a private organization is having on what type of development that a human is having at the point that it's actually developing, that's going to say a lot about what that future society would look like.
Yeah. And again, I mean, these are all just speculations, but now we're at the point to where, since this is early on in the ectogenetic development, CRISPR gene editing technology is a viable path.
Mm-hmm.
So you can not only potentially get more viable fetuses out of each fertilized ovum, you can edit all of the genes of all those eventual humans, so that there are there's no
they can be
illness.
Resilient to the environment that they're about to be a part of.
There's no genetic diseases. There's no predisposition to cancers. There's no predisposition to heart disease. All of those things that are genetic markers of infirmity. And theologically, people would say those are genetic markers of sin, right? Because the teachings of the church is that
the fall of man is because of sin. The reason that there's mortality is because Adam and Eve fell.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the theological idea of sin is not merely the behavior of the individual. It's the fact that we no longer live in a perfect environment. So this would be humans trying to build another Tower of Babel back towards the creation garden. So again, these are all there's and so and this is the
Can we call this entire thing the Wax Wings Initiative?
it's and then there's just to put a bow on the three components of uniqueness. So there's genetic uniqueness, there's circumstantial uniqueness, but then there's also and this is a religious perspective. There's an eternal uniqueness. So the belief of Catholics and many other religions is that that at the moment that unique DNA is created, there's also the unique
An eternal soul.
An eternal soul.
Yeah.
So, and that soul is from the Catholic perspective, it's not a recycled soul. So it's not a reincarnation. It's not like, it doesn't matter if you kill or you destroy this ovum, because it's just going to get recycled on the circle of life, and it'll come back in another life form. That soul that's developed is an individual, unique soul that will continue in perpetuity.
I think that I am going to be really, really interested when I'm an old man and I get to see what Martians turn into. It won't be little green men. It'll just be weird next generation test tube babies.
Yeah. And maybe they end up with these huge heads because their head never gets squeezed.
Yeah.
And never, maybe they'll have very, very narrow, thin frames with not a lot of muscular to them because they never have to deal with gravity.
There's a science fiction series called The Expanse, and I have a lot of my clients tell me that it's one of the best science fiction novel series that they've read. And it was originally a show on Sci-Fi, and then after I think it was the third season, Sci-Fi canceled the show, and it actually was one of Jeff Bezos's favorite show. So Jeff Bezos funded the show and put it onto Prime to continue out the story. And it's this really interesting political drama of future civilizations where Mars is civilized and Earth is kind of the elites. Those that went to Mars are kind of the military masterminds because they really progress technology, so they have way more capabilities than what the elites on Earth have. But then there's a civilization of people that are getting rare materials to harvest, and they work on the asteroid belt as miners, and they're called the Belters. And what's really interesting about the Belters is after generations and generations of these people that have lived in a zero gravity environment, they are exactly what you're describing. They're a lot taller. They're very slender because the impacts of gravity haven't impacted them. And early on in the show, there's like political drama that happens, and there's a Belter that goes to Earth as a punishment. And just being in the gravity of Earth was crushing his body, and he just wasn't used to it. And it becomes this very interesting dynamic of how the people that are born, raised, and continue to have generations, like our bodies are amazing things. We adapt very, very well. We're a very resilient species to all sorts of environments. And to think that we wouldn't change towards the environments of space or another planet, when there's very clear evidence that even in the small amount of time in space that astronauts are there, that they have bone density problems. So I think that you're going to be spot on. It'll be unfortunate that we don't get to see like the multiple generations aspect of it, but I would 100% take a ride to Mars and die on Mars. Everybody's going to die. I don't want to die in a hospital. That sounds terrible. If it's on a rocket ride, that's going to be an explosion. That's going to be this epic thing. If it winds up being in a sandstorm on Mars, that sounds terrifying, and it'll be over quick. But these sound like much more exciting deaths than sitting around waiting to die on a planet that I'm waiting for any number of things to kill me.
Yeah, they're including World War III. So maybe there's a
Well, before we get into World War III, let's get on some fun notes. Let's do some dinner time conversation. Because let's not talk about Russia and Ukraine right now. Let's talk about not that question. That question sucks. That's how most families play these things. What natural event would you like to witness in person? So, from the table topics family dinner, what natural event would you like to witness in person?
there's so I'm gonna use the dimension of scale. So the physical dimension of height, width, and length.
Yeah.
To say, I would really like to witness, like with my own eyeballs, the development of a human being, like we've just been talking about. To be like, there was a movie when I was a kid called, Journey to the Center of the Universe or something like that, and it was about this family that was put inside a tiny, they were shrunk and they were put inside this tiny little vessel so that they could go around inside the body and see
so
all.
So it wasn't as traumatizing as The Miracle of Life.
Yeah. But of all the things that I would like there, I mean, just to note the way that that these cells that have an apparent sentience to them. So like, within that little clump of, of cells, some of them are like, well, I'm going to be the head and I'm going to be the lungs and I'm going to be the heart. And they're so like the entirety of the genomic map for making a human being is present in every cell. But at some point, the cells decide, you do that, and I'm going to do this. So they only focus on, oh, I'm becoming an eyeball. I'm becoming a kidney. I'm becoming a thumbnail or whatever. And so there's a conversation that takes place. There's a dialogue that takes place amongst all these identical cells that are just
on how they diverge.
Yeah, they're just stem cells. So they're fetal stem cells and they could become anything. But they don't all become anything. They all become something very specific. And so what is that conversation? That doesn't just like, because it's not like, oh, well, this cell only got the kidney portion of the DNA. That cell that's becoming
they have
everything.
Kidney,
they got everything.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm going to be on page 72. You take this and you take that.
Which one of those decides, okay, I'm the cell that's on top. I'm going to be the head. You're the one on the bottom. So you're the one that's the foot. So we're going to start developing based off of top to bottom.
Yeah. We used to, when I was in the long range surveillance unit, we would get missions. And when we would get the missions, they would come in the form of a target folder and a mission packet. And so you get this target folder and you get a mission packet, and now you go into this planning process. So you can get the mission accomplished. But basically you get those orders and you grab them and you're like, you tear out one part of it and you give it to one guy and you say, you look at this and you figure out what we have to do in order to get that done. You look at this and you figure out what we have to do. So you end up taking everybody on the team and everybody on the team is trying to figure out one thing, but then when you come back together, you've reduced the time it takes to consume all that information by a factor of 5, because you got 5 guys thinking about the one thing. So I mean, I vision that as being the kind of discussion that takes place very early on in human development. Where
you would imagine that the way that your cells talk to each other is like, all right, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
That is what shaped me.
There's so, and you got to wonder do the cells that are going to become the brain, do they make the decisions, or is it just like completely? It's like in Hawaii we used to have potluck dinners.
Yeah,
and it was so fun to have the potluck dinners because we had friends that were so diverse. We had friends that had Chinese heritage and Japanese heritage and Filipino heritage and Hawaiian heritage and Samoan heritage and then people coming from the southeastern United States, the southwestern United States, the midwestern United States. So all these people would come together for a potluck. So Hawaiian potlucks are the most fascinating potlucks you could ever possibly have, because it's like you have
no idea what you're going to get, but it's going to be a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and you do this thing where the first time you go through the line, you just take a small spoonful of everything, because you don't know if you're going to hate it. And if you just get a spoonful, then you're like, oh, maybe I got to take 3 bites of something that's really, really gross. But and then you know what you're going to go for on the second trip around. But so is it? But then there's like a Lutheran potluck where they're like, okay, we're going to have a potluck. You bring the salad, you bring the dessert, and everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to bring.
Yeah, and there's not this situation where there's like 7 desserts.
Yeah. So there, and it's like literally like just going to a dinner that is, a full dinner, but instead of one person cooking it, 7 families do or whatever. So is it going to be like a Lutheran potluck, or is it going to be like a Hawaiian potluck? I mean, the dialogue that these cells have.
Is it going to be free for all or a lot more organized chaos?
Yeah. And I don't think we know, because all we do is we know that somehow they develop, and then we're like, oh, these cells positionally end up being the head, and these cells end up being the spinal column and all this, so that we know that there's an outcome where the right cells develop into the right things. But at the very beginning, it was all those cells were identical, and any one of them could have chosen to be any one of the little pieces parts.
I think it's interesting that in answering this question, your focus is on watching life and my focus is on watching death. Because the first thing that I think of with this question is we once posed, we will sometimes have really weird questions that we just ask at the shop, and it's like the ongoing question for a couple weeks at a time as we're going through our clients. Some of them are more appropriate than others. And one question that we were asking for a few weeks was, if you could time travel anywhere in history, forward or back, but you only get to go one direction and you're never coming back home, what is it that you're going to go see? And there's a natural event that I would love to see. It's the end of humanity. And I think that so many people want to think that humans are going to be around forever because we're the apex species right now. But the amount of time that humans have been on this planet is a blip, and the amount of time that we've been on this planet is a blip in comparison to how long it's been since the dinosaurs have been on this planet. And when you compare it to the size or the duration of how long the universe has existed, it is minuscule. It is so tiny. So to think that there is going to be a last human is a realistic thought. And I would love to time travel to if I'm 38 right now, and let's say I'm gonna die at 79. So I've got 41 years left. I want to time travel to 41 years before the last person dies. I want to see the thing that takes out everything. Is it actually going to be, nuclear Armageddon? Do we do it in on ourselves? Is it something that we just maybe I'm not traveling that far into the future? Maybe it actually is that I'm traveling so far into the future that the only thing that humans didn't figure out is how to get the rest of humans off of the planet before the sun goes supernova. Maybe that's how far into the future it is. And I have no idea, but I have a lot of confidence that humanity is a limited edition species, and we're on the run right now. That's pretty cool, but I'm really curious of what is going to be the event that will eventually take us all out. And you can speculate all day long, but no one really knows.
And that's what when Musk talks about perpetuating consciousness.
Yeah.
There's so
and that's one of the things that I can actually agree with him on. I think that the idea of the fact that there's no meteor defense system for the planet, that sucks, because I think we have the technology for it. The fact that we have so much animosity towards our fellow species that we are on the brink of World War III, it kind of sucks. The fact that people like me don't have faith in a positive future, that we're not having children, and that might be the thing that outs all of us, that could suck too. Who knows? Well, let's talk about World War III.
So, Saudi Arabia is really stepping up to the plate in this peace process, I think, because they, first they hosted a meeting between the United States and Russia, and now they hosted a meeting between the United States and Ukraine. And I think it's one of the reasons I think it's interesting is because the U.S. wants to be the broker of a peace deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But if you look at things from the Russian perspective, that doesn't make any sense because we're not a neutral party.
No, and they have momentum.
Yeah, so like the terms of the ceasefire deal that was announced, I think, yesterday, is basically a 30-day ceasefire where all hostilities are stopped on land, sea, and in the air. And then in that 30-day peace process, they begin negotiations for a more lasting peace that talks about land distribution and returning of POWs and refugee populations and all this kind of stuff. There's but from the Russian perspective, because like when we paused our provision of military supplies and intelligence support, that was a big thing. That was a very, very big thing. But now that the Ukrainians have agreed to this peace proposal, we said, oh, well, we're going to turn that on again. Well, as long as we are giving long-range attack munitions to the Ukrainians, and because they don't have the capacity to operate those weapon systems, and they don't have the intelligence collection capacities to to do reasonable targeting efforts for like strikes and the like. They're dependent upon the United States for the provision of weapons and for the provision of intelligence so that they can use those weapons. So when any long-range attack munitions are used to kill Russians, that's not Ukrainians killing Russians. That's Americans killing Russians. And they know that. There's so I would if I were Russia, I would be like, as long as you are providing resources to Ukraine, a ceasefire doesn't make any sense, because all they're going to do is they're going to spend 30 days building up their stockpile of artillery shells and long-range attack missiles.
It's the exact same thing that Hamas was doing during their ceasefires, is like all you're giving them is an opportunity to catch their breath.
Yeah. And if Ukraine does not have American weapons and American intelligence support, then now a ceasefire starts to make a little bit more sense, because they're going to go into the negotiations as combatants with Ukraine. But as it stands right now, the Americans just don't say the quiet part out loud. Russia is at war with the United States, and Ukraine are the soldiers on the ground that are fighting this war between Russia and the United States.
There was I was listening on BBC this morning, and they were interviewing a representative from the Kremlin, and one of the interesting things that they were talking about is Putin viewed Biden as an enemy, but he views Trump as a rival. And I thought that was actually very interesting, because they are going after the same thing. They're both going after those minerals. And that's what the deal's about, is who wants access to that. And to that extent, you realize, yeah, Ukraine's caught in the middle of this. America wants something, Russia wants something. Russia grabbed for it when they saw there was an opening for it because Biden was in office. And now Trump is there saying, like, no, we wanted that. That's something that we are going to have our hand on. We will continue supporting this. We want this. And it's interesting to see how the shift in respect from Putin to the current administration has changed the vernacular that they're using, because I understand the enemy aspect of Biden and Putin. That makes sense. They were very, very, very standoffish with one another. But the rivalry between these two, with Trump and Putin, that makes sense in itself, because they're willing to communicate. They're both willing to say what their goals are. They're willing to say what they're not willing to settle on and what they are willing to settle on. And they're willing to set those kind of lines in the sand, as it were.
Yeah, and I think I think that that Biden really had two things that he was trying to do with the Russian-Ukrainian war. I think the first is Biden has always been somebody who would act like a tough guy in order to get people to like him. So, there's a great clip of a guy, and I think his first bid for the White House, who questioned his educational pedigree, and Biden's like, I was the first person in my family
to double down with a bunch of lies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was using it like he was berating the guy who dared to question him, and then he just started spewing just like nonsense out of his mouth that, he got an academic scholarship, he was at the top of his class, and la 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 la. And he used all this all this bullshit to like cut this guy off at the knees. So everybody thought he was a tough guy and he had all these things. And then eventually people are like, well, he was lying, you know? So there's, you know, and I thought that the Democratic Party got it right with regard to Biden twice. The two times they rejected him as a candidate, they got it right. The one time they were like, hey, we're gonna hitch our wagon to this guy.
Yeah.
They got it totally wrong. But he ended up being, there was an interesting article that I read this week where they analyzed the signatures on the documents that were produced by the Biden White House, and like almost all of them were done by AutoPen. So it's not uncommon, you know. There's people that have to sign like 1 billion documents or whatever. They'll use an AutoPen, and an AutoPen just looks at the signature, and then you put an actual pin in it, and it writes your signature.
Haley and I were actually talking about something kind of similar the other night because we were watching a video of one of the executive actions getting signed, and she'd asked me if there really is a different pen for each executive action. I was like, yeah, honestly, it's a huge ordeal. Like if you're given a pen from a past president, like there weren't a lot of executive actions that happened. So that was a huge honor that was bestowed upon you, because typically the executive action was about something specific, and the pen would go to the person that it would be the most metaphorically responsive to it, I guess. I mean, it was the perfect one is like the executive action of releasing the JFK files and the fact that he gave that pen to Bobby Kennedy. That makes sense, and that's kind of been the extent of it. But what's been really interesting is Trump likes signing things a lot. And anytime you see him signing things, there's a whole freaking box full of these Sharpies that are the presidential Sharpies that are being made. So I'm curious, is this him flooding the market? Like, does the value of all the other pens no longer become as it's not special anymore because he's giving pens away to everybody?
And the other thing about Trump with his signing is it's very apparent that he has put a lot of effort into making a unique signature that
it's recognizable.
It's very recognizable, very difficult to replicate.
Yep.
And
the sound of the Sharpie in the way that he does it's a silence that demands attention. Like, it's the weirdest thing. It is very Trumpian. And there's no other way of describing it. But when he is scribbling his signature on that Sharpie, it is very much, that's what Donald Trump is doing.
Yeah. And so getting a pin from him would be a very special gift. I think it would be I
do think that it'd still be valued in that way. It's just, I think that he's given away more pens in the first 2 months than all other presidents combined to this point.
And like, he had that rally and he's just like throwing the pens out to the crowd like out of a t-shirt gun, And
also, this is one of the things that I've been talking about in the shop is like the guy is a reality TV show host, and he has turned politics into a reality TV show in a way that is like, I kind of think is a bastardization of the political system, but it's also arguably getting more people aware of what's going on with their government. And fundamentally, if that's what you should be doing, is making it so that way your citizens are more aware of what's happening, I have said many times, I think that the current administration is more transparent than the last administration. And I hate reality TV. Maybe that's why I hate what he's doing, but he's showing people stuff and he's making a spectacle.
Yeah, I was reading another article this past week where Stephen Miller is viewed within the administration as being the prime minister. And people even call him that. They're like, hey, you got to go get that to the PM or whatever. Because he's the guy who's actually making decisions on domestic policy, the day-to-day decisions on domestic policy. That's one of the things that I think is interesting about Trump is
He's the Queen of England.
yeah.
I'm sorry, he's the king.
There's he's the so like people, I used the auto pen thing. People genuinely believe, and I'm one of those people who believe that other people besides Joe Biden were making the executive decisions for the Biden White House. I think Biden was a kind of a puppet that but but the people who were making decisions for him were like these nameless, faceless bureaucrats. Nobody knows who. It's like, okay, well, who was controlling the auto pen? Who was the person who was saying, okay, we're going to get the president's signature on that. Give me that document. We're going to get the president's signature on it. Wink, wink, nod, nod. How many of those things went out that Biden didn't know because the only things he knew about were, hey, here's your talking points for today's press briefing or whatever.
Yeah, and when's next nap time?
And to a certain extent, Trump is doing a very similar thing, but it's not a nameless, faceless bureaucrat. It's Steve Miller. And he's so then you're like, oh wow. So, Trump is this silent generation, old money, kind of a used car salesman guy, but he has delegated the power of daily decision making to a millennial, a talented, smart millennial who's getting the job done, but he's a very he's not just a Trump loyalist in person, which is the most important thing, but he's a brand loyalist to the Trumpian way, the populist conservative MAGA style Republican.
Yeah, I will say that I do think that one of the things that this administration figured out correctly was including a lot of young people. And it's, there's decisions that I still don't agree with fundamentally socially. And I think that they're going in a direction that I personally don't want to see. However, they're putting people in that are making these decisions that are going to have to live long enough to see them through. And I think that is important because that's been the biggest struggle with having the last 4 years is, man, you're making all these shitty decisions and you're not even going to be around enough to see the disaster that it is. This is actually, and this week specifically, I've been having a really interesting conversation about the stock market's tanking, because what I find fascinating by it is how early into his administration he's leaning into it. And this whole Fox News interview where he's saying that he's not taking a recession out of the question. Every president wants to avoid a recession. That is the biggest stain on any administration. And I was talking about this about a week ago. And what I think is really interesting is you always have administrations inheriting the prior administration. Bush inherited a huge surplus, but then 9/11 happened. So Obama inherited a shit economy. And then Trump inherited the remnants of a better economy. And, you're always getting the credit for work you didn't do. But what's interesting about this recession is he's doing it. And he's not even telling people that it's not going to happen, but he's doing it early enough in his administration where there's legitimately enough time to be able to rally and recover. And what I find really interesting is, do we have enough time in this administration to be able to see both the impact of what you're doing directly as well as the impact of what you're trying to cause after the fact? Or are the Democrats going to be able to have an opportunity to try and get somebody in to replace you? And then all of those economic benefits are the Democrats' motivation and momentum to be able to be like, hey, look at this thing that we've done for you. You tried that guy again, it didn't work out. But look, now we are providing you all the economic progress that he wasn't able to give you. I will say that he's kind of smart for doing it so early on. And if we can recover with enough time to see the impacts of it, I'll give him credit. I'll 100% give him credit. But right now, all of my stock values are less than the money I spent on them. And that is not the case as of 2 weeks ago. Oh, it's very different than where I was 2 weeks ago. So that needs to change before he's right.
But the other side is as things get cheaper and cheaper, it's a good time to buy.
There's 100%. Yeah. Oh man. I had literally been talking to somebody at the shop about how when one of my stocks was around $20 and then it shot up to around 55, I was like, man, I wish I had an opportunity to buy more of that when it was $20. And here's my opportunity.
Yeah, there's and one of the things that I think is interesting along the same line about Trump is he's really hitched his foreign policy wagon to the tariff. And people are like, I don't understand why he's doing tariff. Our governor, the Colorado governor, Jared Polis, lives right down the street from me. He's just on TV all the time, railing against tariffs and saying that they're inflationary and so on and so forth. Which is, to a certain extent, it's true. Yeah, there's that money's got to come from somewhere, but the purpose behind tariffs isn't to
it's not to penalize people; it's to bring manufacturing back to America.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
and we have been allowing the manufacturing capacity, mining and manufacturing capacity of the U.S. to deteriorate for decades, since the 70s. Now, when people are like, so we had a 20-year war where we had like our supremacy on the battlefield was never questioned, but our supremacy on the battlefield in a war with China in the and over Taiwan, or a war in Europe fighting, one-on-one with Russia, or a big war in the Middle East where we're directly fighting Iran, or all three of those in a simultaneous world war. We need our own steel capacity. We need our own computer chip capacity. We need our own lithium capacity. We need,
in the same way that Europe needs their own military, we need the things that we haven't been providing ourselves.
Yeah, and there's and we used to, so we built this huge manufacturing machine in our nation in order to fight World War II. And then we did a really good job, of transitioning that wartime machinery into an engine of prosperity. that was the 1950s satellite family TV sets, bills where every family had 2 cars, ownership, and there was a time when the Made in USA sticker was seen as a symbol of value and pride. And then the 1980s happened. From 1980 onward, we don't care where we get whatever we get as long as it's as cheap as we can get it.
One of the things that they were talking about a couple days ago, and I can't remember who had said this, but somebody had said that the view of the American dream to have the most cheap goods possible is not a correct view of the American dream. And this was interesting when a couple weeks ago we had a big snowfall, and moving into the house, I don't own a snow shovel. I've never needed to own a snow shovel at all. And I go to Home Depot, and the only thing that they have on the end cap is this cheap, crappy $20 made in China snow shovel. And I'm like, all right, that's the option. I've got an HOA. I have to clear my driveway. I'll get this. I go through the checkout, and then as I'm leaving, they have this display at the exit of the store of all of these made in America snow shovels. And they're all like 3 times the price. But immediately you can tell that the quality is there. And that was the thing that I was looking for. I do not care about the price. I want buy once, cry once. Get the thing that is going to last you a long time and has better design, better manufacturing, better components in it. And typically, American made is the way to go. And I had to walk all the way back to customer service. And I was like, I thought this was the thing that you only had. This was the thing that I wanted. Take more of my money, please. And I do think that once American manufacturing can come back to the United States, I don't necessarily think the increase in price that people are going to feel from these tariffs is going to go away. I think that it's a kind of correctionary way of saying like, okay, well, this is the new price that things are going to be, which was probably 50% more than what you were spending beforehand. But do you want to have this thing that's 150% of the price and is this cheap, shitty made product from overseas? Or do you want to have the product that was made here in America that's way better? And if you're comparing apples to apples cost-wise, why wouldn't you buy American? And I think that that's more of what the ultimate goal is.
And I think that, one of the ways that people can show their patriotism is by drinking enough Tennessee whiskey for yourself and 2 Canadians.
Says 2 sober people.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you were talking about drink. So this is the beer that I'm drinking.
This is the beer that I can't drink because I live in Idaho.
I know, isn't that crazy?
It's stupid.
So like I've got this, and then I've got another, like a Scottish ale or something like that. No, it's another Irish. So I have in my refrigerator, I've got 7 different kinds of beer, all brewed by Athletic Brewing Company, all non-alcoholic, and every one of them is delicious.
Sent to me via the mail.
Yeah, I know.
I want it.
And it's so funny because they're delivered by FedEx, and the FedEx guy always lugs these cases of beer up 3 flights of stairs and puts them literally on my doorstep. And so this is something that everybody can do. If you get packages delivered to your house, it takes you like 3 seconds to go to the website and click and give that delivery person a compliment. But that aggregates, and their supervisor knows that, oh man, this guy gets all kinds of compliments. So you can give a tip to your drivers by just saying something nice. So I always do that for the FedEx driver. I'm like, oh man, perfect product placement. Thank you so much. But I get that I don't even have to go to the liquor store. But I do. I go because I get this kind of athletic beer.
See, they sell those at Costco here.
Yeah. And I get the hazy IPA, which is the orange can. And they probably sell those there too.
It's just their mail order club that I don't get access to. And it bums me out because you tell me about all these really, really interesting flavors. And coming from having loved, craft beers and Boise being such a beer city, and now that I don't drink, and it's like, oh, here's the options that you get. But for everyone that's not living in Idaho, here's some other options because we can just ship them directly. But your state really likes to say that, no, if it's beer, you cannot send beer directly to people.
And it's so funny that you mentioned that being used to the craft beer manufacturer community. There's because like I became a beer snob when we were living in Germany. Before I went to Germany, I was a Buckhorn beer, whatever is the cheapest beer that you go into the store, and you can buy for whatever the lowest price beer is. Because I just thought that all canned beer was the same, and I did like Coors, and I liked Pabst Blue Ribbon, and I liked all these. That was my thing. But then I went to Germany, and I was like, wow, this is delicious. And we had in Germany, I don't know if they still do, but we had a beer guy who delivered beer every week. So every Tuesday, we just had a standing order. Every Tuesday, this guy would come and he would bring the weekly order of beer and set it on our doorstep. And we would just put the empties out. So we would return the empties. He'd take the empties away and drop off new beer every Tuesday. And so it's fresh, locally produced beer, all in a German style. But there was like, I would get Weizenbier, which is just wheat beer, and Pils. And I would get all these great beers. And I remember when I came back from Germany, I packed like 2 cases of beer in my duffel bag. And so I'd put a beer bottle in a sock, and then I would roll that up in a T-shirt, then roll it up in a pair of pants, and shove it into my, and I think only one bottle broke. But I remember going through customs, and you got to declare everything. And I'm like, I have way more beer inside this bag than I'm allowed to have. And I just came clean with the guy. I'm like, look, I got all this beer that's inside there. If I got to pay a fine or whatever, let me pay the fine. But I really don't want to have to unpack this bag because it took me like 4 hours to get all these beers inside the duffel bag, and I'll never be able to get them in again. So, but I went, and your grandpa Dick, we went up to visit him in Connecticut. He was living in Connecticut. So when we landed in, I think we landed in Atlanta, and then we drove up the coast to visit him and Elsa, his wife at the time, in Connecticut, and it was a big deal. He's like, "Oh man, you brought like actual German beer back from Germany," and he was so happy about it. It's just great, and that was really the time when. And it's so interesting. Sam Adams, the brand Sam Adams beer, was one of the first like American style beers to start coming back, and it just built up from there. And now the craft American beer is, I mean, it's probably the dominant beer in the market.
It was it's funny because you and Mom both ruined me for any kind of cheap alcohol at all, because you guys always had the mentality growing up of like, if you want to try something, we would rather you try it in the house where you're safe and then that there's some kind of a good situation. And I remember the very first time that I ever asked mom to pick up something from the liquor store that I was 19. And I'd never drank up to this point, and I had been reading a GQ magazine. Gee, I think it was 18. Uh, 18 or 19. Anyways, shouldn't have done it. Shouldn't have done it. So I see an advertisement for Grey Goose, and I'm like, oh, I'm a sucker for marketing. Cool. I know nothing about this. I want to try this. This vodka is the thing that I want to try. So I asked mom if she'd go and pick me up a bottle of Grey Goose vodka. And I'm not going to any party. I'm not doing anything. I just simply wanted to try it. This is the first time that I ever wanted to try anything. You said that if I ever wanted to try it, I could try it at home. Will you go buy me something? So she goes to the liquor store, comes back, and she's like, Chris, that was $40. It's like, okay, here's $40. And that being my very first interaction with alcohol, I was like, cool. Alcohol costs $40. That's how much it is. And I didn't have a bad time with it. So the next time I drank, mom was working at Walmart, and she had this coworker in the electronics section. It was this girl, Christina, and she and her husband, I was friends with. Anytime I'd go visit mom, I would talk to this girl, and they had invited me over to a party. And this is when Zima existed. And I remember having them feed me green apple Zima through a snorkel. It was the worst experience ever. And they're like, well, yeah, it's like $5 for a 6-pack. I was like, so $40 is the price of alcohol. And I never really went anything lower than mid-shelf. Like, I would only do mid-shelf spirits. I would do high-end. And as I started getting really into it, I found that I loved Scotch, and I loved like single malts, and I loved Japanese whiskey, and I loved all this really expensive stuff. And then Brad was starting to get into beer because you were getting him into beer. And I was like, this stuff tastes like shit. I hate this. It's disgusting because it's all these macro breweries that are trying to do an everyday beer. And then I eventually get introduced to New England style hazy IPAs. And I'm like, this is what it is. Oh my God, this is amazing. It's juicy and it's flavorful and it's so fantastic. And then I started finding what I loved about dark beers in the wintertime, and like getting a good stout, and really trying to find the different flavor profiles of all these different things that the brewers were really putting complexities into the beer. So going sober, and it's like, cool, we've got Athletic Golden. Hey, we've got Athletic Golden. Hey, we've got Athletic Golden, but we've also got their hazy. And you just don't have the selection with NAs. It's come so much better than what it was. It's not just O'Doul's, but it's still, I want your mail order club. I want your mail order club.
Hey, it made quitting drinking alcohol so much easier for me because I was able to continue drinking beer. And the only thing that changed is, to a certain extent, going to happy hour was a social activity for me. And then for a while I was going to, at the pub that I used to drink alcohol at, they had athletic beer there. Well, first they didn't have it. So I brought one in and I gave it to the manager, and he was like, oh, wow, we should change to this. So they changed to it. So I would go in and I would just get an NA beer, and it was more expensive to go to a bar and get an NA beer, but there's the social aspect of it.
Yep.
Yeah,
and, you're paying for something else.
Yeah, you're paying so you can talk to the people at the bar. But then they switched to another kind of NA beer, and it just wasn't it wasn't worth going anymore. Because it's like, oh, okay, well, and you were talking about the whole sugary thing, so I could get a soda, and they've got some really great sodas there. They got a great root beer, they got a great ginger beer, they got all these really great sodas.
Who wants to pay $6 for a soda?
And it's a soda that's got a great soda with cane sugar and everything, but holy cow, you're talking like 390 calories in a glass. And this is here. This
65?
Irish Red is 80 calories.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to feel guilty about it. You don't have to feel like you're going to get a buzz. You just have to have the ability to enjoy a good drink.
Yeah. So it's Idaho should change their laws
about many things. I think that's probably a good place for us to end off tonight. So, anything else you want to cover on this week's Separate Talk?
No, I think we talked about Musk and ectogenesis. I think that was probably an interesting, at least for me, it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, I think that it'll be an interesting way of seeing where things can go. But sounds like Buddy wants your attention. So I will say thank you to all of you guys who have been paying attention to the Separate Talk podcast. If you haven't already, go and like and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Amazon Music. We really appreciate all the comments. And if you have any thoughts on ectogenesis, leave a comment on Spotify. If you guys have anything to say, we'll probably bring it up in the next week's episode. But until then, be well and have a great week.
Woof, woof, woof.